So these are West African elephants, and there are just 550 left in Mali. Now that might not sound like much, but it's 12% of the whole West African population, and they make the longest and most fascinating migration of all elephants. In 2006, after 3 years of study, we realized that if things didn't turn around very soon, they would be gone. Gone. And so our first thought was to take the conventional approach. You know, you analyze the problem, you make a solution, and then you make a grand plan. And then the government does nothing. Well, we decided not to take that approach. We just didn't have time. And we discovered that a lot would depend on people. Now, we were able to track these elephants because some of them had been fitted with GPS collars. And so we knew their position every 2 hours over a period of 18 months. And we could see, for example, that when you put the points on top of a satellite image, you could see, for example, that they spent the whole of the dry season in the north of their range. And then when you zoomed in, you could see that they spent most of their time around little lakes. And as one lake dried up, they'll move on to another one, and then on to another one, and another one, until they ended up at the one lake which never dried, Lake Banzena. Then, when they could smell that it was raining off in the south, off they'd go. Because in the south, there's really, really good food, but no lakes. So they could only be there while it was raining. But that wasn't the whole story. When they got to the south, they didn't disperse, as you might expect, but they stayed in one confined place. And we discovered that the local chief, he was a pastoralist, and he was also very powerful. And he'd managed to prevent anybody from clearing this land. And so they found a haven and lots of good food just at the time of the year when they needed it, when they were having their babies. Now, when we first started studying this area, it was completely degraded, overused, overexploited. People were clearing land, they were cutting forest, and they were threatening to completely cut the elephant migration route. Increasing herds of cattle were trampling the soil and drinking the lakes dry, and the elephants were coming to rely more and more on Lake Banzena, just as human occupation around that lake was increasing. It was clear a crisis was imminent. But what could we do? We had an area the size of Switzerland. We had 2 ranger posts with no vehicles. We had no money at all. There was no government morale and no political will. In fact, everything we thought of doing just seemed utterly futile. And so we had to think again. We had to take a step back. And we thought, well, actually, instead of raising loads of resources to try and impose our grand plan, what we really wanted was for the relationship between humans, elephants, and the environment to automatically result in elephant conservation. And for that, we needed a shared vision. And so we talked to everybody. We talked to everybody. We showed them our results, and we asked them what they thought of it. And we talked to them about their lives and about the elephants. And we discovered that many of them said, well, we don't want elephants to disappear, because if elephants disappear, it means the environment is no longer good for us. And so we created all kinds of education materials about how to live with elephants. We started a schools program, and Malians came to take pride in their elephants. And villagers were saying to us, well, if the elephants disappear, our area's no longer special. But then, the crisis we all feared. In 2009, Lake Banzena dried up completely. It was drunk dry by over 50,000 cattle. What to do? In the past, government foresters from Timbuktu had tried evicting everybody, but they all gradually just came back again. And so we tried something else. We spoke to every single household living around the lake, and we asked them about their lives. And we discovered that over 96% of the cattle using that lake didn't belong to the local people at all, but to wealthy urban Malians living hundreds of miles away, who'd amass these enormous herds as a sign of prestige, and then send them off to find food and water. We discovered that over 50% of the local population suffered from waterborne disease and were willing to move if they could find somewhere with good pasture and clean water. And so that's what happened. We raised some money, we drilled deep for water, and a few months later, the women said to us, "Since we moved here, we no longer have stomach aches. The men can go back to Banzena if they want, but we're staying here." But there's more. The reason this area was so degraded was because there were no commonly accepted rules of resource management. And so we brought all the different clans and ethnicities together to discuss this problem. And they created a management committee composed of elders who made some rules. And they created these patrols of young men who'd work with government foresters to enforce those rules. And they protected the forests, they protected the elephant migration route, they controlled hunting, they charged the cattle for access to water, and they set aside this enormous pasture area, 14 times the size of Manhattan. Yeah, incredible. And we helped them protect it with fire breaks. And as a result, that was the only part of the whole of the north that didn't lose its pasture to fire that year. Well, when the adjacent communities heard this, they all came clamoring and saying, "Please help us do the same thing." And so everything was going really well. Well, we didn't have to persuade them at all. They all wanted to do this. But then, there was the crisis of 2012, the coup. Overnight, government fled to the capital, and the area was overrun by armed groups of Tuareg rebels, jihadis. It was awash with guns and completely lawless. I mean, meanwhile, in Central Africa, elephants were being slaughtered and massacred by their hundreds for their ivory to fund war and rebellion. Our hearts sunk. We were a little project, but the elephants needed us more than ever. And so we convened a big community gathering, 4 days for people to discuss their experiences, try and make sense of what was happening, talk about their problems, and how to protect the elephants. And we discovered that one of their big problems was they couldn't get food because all the vehicles were being hijacked. And so we arranged for it to be brought in, grain to be brought in piecemeal by donkey cart. And the elders said to us, "Well, we'll transmit the message far and wide, including to the leaders of the armed groups, that killing elephants is stealing from us." But they were also very worried about their young men joining the armed groups. Jihadis were paying between $30 and $50 a day, a huge amount for these people. And so we created vigilance networks of young men throughout the elephant range who would look out for elephant killing and find out who were the perpetrators. And although we only paid them in food, not one of them joined the armed groups because, they said, our work was more noble. Only 8 elephants have been killed so far. But there's been another result that was unexpected. By putting the spotlight on the elephants, the committed individuals within government came forward, and we were able to support them in their work. And over the years, they came to occupy the key positions. And so government morale soared, and political will completely transformed. And so we have a model, and it's working so far. I'm constantly astonished. I'm continually in awe of the response of the people and of their achievements. There is so much more to do, but we can go forward, all because we shifted our perspective. We were willing to not know, to not have the answer, and so we had to talk to people And we grew solutions bit by bit, in partnership, in dialogue. And so those solutions were very adapted and grounded in the local context. And so by empowering our allies, people were not just the problem, but luckily for the elephants, they became the solution. Thank you.